and inspirational. The topic is From Greece to Columbus, the Falsification of History. Now, the essential purpose of this panel is to analyze, critique, and destroy myths that have been masqueraded as facts from the 5th century to the present day. As you all know, they're getting ready to put on a big celebration for Columbus next year, like he discovered something, people that were already here. And the panel that we have for you this afternoon would dispel all of that and bring to us once and for all the truth about Africa, the truth about Africans, and the truth about the European and his role in what he's done to destroy Africa and our role in terms of giving civilization to the world. So without any further ado, I'd first like to present to you Professor EdwardScobie. He is a professor of Black Studies in the Black Studies Department at City College in New York. He's also taught there for 17 years. He's taught at Rutgers, Princeton. He's been a mayor of a local city. He's also published and authored a book, Black Britannica. It's the history of blacks in Britain. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to some, present to others, Professor EdwardScobie.
Hotep, my brothers and sisters, Hotep. The panel is concerning itself with the falsification of history. That falsification has been going on for a long time, as you can see, from Greece to Columbus. So that's a very long time indeed. And if we're going to deal with falsification, there must have been falsifiers. We know who these falsifiers were and are. To falsify history means that you're telling lies. You're perjuring yourself. You're writing half-truths. You're writing myths. And we cannot allow these myths to go on any longer, because it is precisely those myths, those lies, those half-truths that have caused us as Africans to lose a vision of Africa, the real Africa. People condition themselves when they talk about Africa, and they're positioned around the slave trade and slavery. Africa goes further back in time. In fact, we know as Africans that Africa goes back to the beginning of time. We are the beginning of time on this planet. And so it is precisely that, the removal of these perjuries, that we are about. I think it was Michael Bradley, in his The Iceman Inheritance, who said that the trouble with the world is the white man.
Yes.
I will say also the white woman.
Please.
And it is this trouble that has caused the confusions, the contentions, the fragmentations of us, our people, as we are not only on the motherland of Africa, but everywhere in the diaspora, everywhere on this planet that African peoples live. And this is not a job. It's a sacred mission. It's a sacred mission that goes on even before the womb and goes on all throughout our natural lives, even when we become ancestors. It's a cyclical process in which we cannot divorce any of our time. Whatever talents we may have, whether it is in writing, whether it is in building, whether it is in doctrine, in administering the law, these are of secondary importance if they do not concern themselves these talents with the redemption of Africa. It is for that purpose that we acquire this training. And I call it training. Again, to talk about falsifying history. We are after knowledge, African knowledge, the beginning of knowledge, to go back to our ancestors and find out. So if we are after knowledge, we must be after truth. And if a history is a falsifying one, it cannot have been after truth. We are the ones that must supply the truth. I am reminded here of something that Jean-Jacques Dessalines once said to Toussaint Louverture, the two great geniuses of the Haitian Revolution. Had Toussaint Louverture taken the advice of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, what eventually happened to him would never have happened to such a brilliant general, such a master tactician. He allowed the fact, and this is something that concerns us today because many of our African brothers and sisters make that same mistake. Toussaint could not divorce himself from France. He thought he was a Frenchman. The French made him understand that he was not. And that is the mistake we make today. There are some of us who cannot divorce ourselves from the entanglement of this unhappy marriage with Europe and Europeans. Toussaint suffered for it. Toussaint thought that there am I, a general, who whipped the daylights out of Napoleon's crack armies.
All right.
I have the country of Haiti in my hand. But he was so, in fact, about integration, about assimilation. You cannot integrate and assimilate with people you have just fought a war with.
That's right.
We cannot do it today because we are fighting a war and we cannot assimilate. We are assimilated as it is.
All right.
Too much, in fact. Toussaint did not realize that. He thought, again, as I said, he was a Frenchman. And so when the people whom he had defeated sent to call him to come to the French general's headquarters, he went. Now you don't do this type of thing. You behaving as an inferior. There you are, a victorious general. Let those French generals like Boudet and the others come to you. You don't go to them. Especially when you know that they are up to no good. He jumped on his horse with 2 soldiers and he galloped to the French headquarters. When he entered, they made him stand, this general, for fully 20 minutes without anybody coming to address him, to take him into the inner sanctum of Boudet's. What happened? After about standing there for a while, a group of French soldiers rushed into the room and clapped him in chains, took him and put him on a ship called the Creole, and took him to France. This is the kind of treachery that one has to expect from people who have made a history, a life of being treacherous. Treacherous even to themselves. So imagine what they will be to us. Even Alexandre Pétion, who was a general with Toussaint, he was the son of a mixed association. His mother was an African who had been enslaved, and his father was a French aristocrat owning a plantation. Pétion had to say that I do not even trust my father because he hates me because I have African blood in me. And how could citizen Toussaint, who had been a slave of these people, think that he could trust them? There are many of us today who think precisely in the same manner as Toussaint. And we will pay the price for it. We are excluded here, all here. But Dessalines said, Henri Christophe said, if I had been called, and if I made the mistake, this stupid mistake of going, I would take 30,000 of my crack soldiers with me. I would ring the headquarters, and I would tell my troops, if in 5 minutes I don't come out of here, burn the place down and kill. Dessalines said, I would not even go. I don't trust those people. In fact, I hate them for the things they did to me. And in saying that, he ripped open his shirt and showed his front, his chest, and his back scarred with the whips and the blows of these French monsters. Yet, when you read the history, if you look at the history of Haiti, of the Haitian Revolution, most of our scholars, even among ourselves, and those other scholars, the falsifiers, they make a great thing of Toussaint. Please don't get me wrong. Toussaint was a great man. He had qualities that we need, and qualities we need even today. He had self-reverence, he had self-knowledge, and he had self-control. And he would say, these three will lead us to power. But there was a but. The fact that Toussaint thought he was a French citizen. He did not think he was an African. In fact, when the Haitian Revolution began, one of the first things that the early leader, Boukman Dada, said, let us reject the white man's God because he has brought evil and pain on us. Let us talk to our African gods because they wish us the power and the strength to defeat the white man's God that brought us crimes, horror, and general and killings. Bookman, an unlettered man, could say that. Dessalines himself could say it. And if you look at those other historians, I cannot call them historians, I call it those other falsifiers. When you look at their history, if you watch, it is good to take the Haitian Revolution as an example. When you look at it, all throughout the history books, a lot of fuss is made about Toussaint Louverture. I am not saying that he was not a great man. What do they say about Dessalines? He was a monster. He was a savage. He was illiterate. In point of fact, he made it a point not to speak French. Whenever he was spoken to in French, he answered in Creole, his mother's language, he said. Dessalines said that I do not trust them. This country, Haiti, it wasn't Haiti then, it was Saint-Dominique. He said, it's a black country, and black it will always remain. Since we cannot go back to Africa, we cannot go back to Senegal, we cannot go back to the Gambia, I am going to create with Bookman Africa in Haiti. It's going to, because the country looks like Africa in a small way. So I'm going to create. There will be no masters and no slaves. And when he was the man that succeeded in winning that war, he, Dessalines, the man they hated, when they asked him, General, what is going to be our flag. You know what he did? He took the French tricolor, he ripped out the white, and he said, that's the flag of Haiti. He said, I do not want to see anything white in this island. In fact, a story is told that while in his headquarters he was making those comments, a white leghorn hen passed across him and he rushed at it with his sword. He couldn't stand white, no way, no how. I wish some of our people could say that today. For there is absolutely no salvation if, in fact, we are talking about regaining our African selves, regaining our African consciousness, taking back the continent. Then we have no right to be talking about joining forces with them. The two do not meet. The two don't go together. The value system is totally different. So we have, if we are calling ourselves holistic African peoples, then we have to be holistic in rejecting totally Europe and all that Europe means to us. In fact, many, long ago in the Caribbean and elsewhere, the men who call themselves Pan-Africanists rejected Europe. In fact, Aimé Césaire, the great Pan-Africanist from Martinique, he said, you know how he described Europe? You know what he said, how he called Europe? He said, Europe is the name for excrement. He was so strong about it. Price Mars said the same thing. Even Garvey, not only his movement, his UNI, but Garvey wrote also, he wrote poems. And Garvey completely wrote savage verse about Europe. Not to mention what he did in his own action. Because Garvey, as you know, was not only about self-esteem, he was about self-help as well. An important thing. The two go together, they're hand in glove. But they were not the only ones who rejected Europe. Europe had nothing to offer them. Europe has nothing to offer us now. And if, again, we're talking, whatever Europeans say, you must always ignore it. It has to be totally ignored. They falsify everything. I want to just mention one other thing. Many of us here know about the famous Sir Cyril Burt IQ scandal. The man falsified figures to show that genes play an important part in the IQ, in the intelligence of people. And since Africans had low intelligence, that they could not, in fact, and their genes could not produce people of high intelligence like Europeans. This man was one of the biggest frauds going. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, this queen's father, George VI, for all his findings on the IQ test. They proved false, fraudulent. There is his picture there. Sir Cyril Burt and the IQ fraud. That is to what lengths they go. He fabricated figures, statistical figures, that had no relevance in reality or truth. They behave like that all the time. We have to be aware of that. Not only that, it is the kind of racism, the out-and-out racism you find in European scholarship, the scholarship that deals with Africa. And if you look well, when we are talking about bringing in books, writing books, as Brother Mulana Karenga told us yesterday, we have to write. And as Our brother said this morning that we have to publish. The publishers will not publish the books of scholars. Look at them there. We have to go back to our own people to do it. That is where, again, Dessalines was right. He said to Toussaint, we have only us. We will sustain us. We will sustain us. They cannot sustain us. They are not about sustaining us, and they are not even thinking about it. Their scholarship is riddled through and through with lies. And they may say what they want. They may not want to include the truth in scholarship, the truth in the curriculum. They don't want to do it. But those of us who are teachers, and we look at our junk mail every day, those what you call orthodox, traditional publishers have sections of their publication devoted to what they call Africana studies, black studies. And if you look at those books, they are all written by them. They are trying to foist those books on us to teach our people. But let us give our books to them. They will not publish it. It is by chance that they published Diop, and I think they are regretting it today. Yeah. Molefi is better equipped, Brother Molefi, to tell you about that. And Dr. Jeffries, my old buddy, or my young buddy. And so it is. But yet they send us books. They send us lists full of the books that Jewish, quote-unquote, scholars, Anglo-Saxon scholars are writing about. And what do you think they're writing about? Whenever you get a book, it is either some kind of permutation on slavery or the slave trade, or some problem, be it crack, be it pregnancy, be it whatever it is, but it's some problem. We are never looked upon as a people with a valid history without problems. I know what our problem has been. Our problem has been the white man and the white woman. Hey. So let us not take their problems, because they are a paranoid people. They are a sick people. If you tell me that you can go on century after century with racism that's getting worse, you are sick, sick, sick. And I'm not about curing your sickness. We are about addressing our own affairs. This kind of racism I'm telling you in their scholarship, it goes back a long, long time. And even when books are written by our people, they try in some way to denigrate those authors. Let me go back to a few of them for you. I think I have some time still. Let me go back.
Take your time.
Not that I really... I'm going to operate on my time, African time. Let us look at some of the things a little while ago that were written by our own people and see the kind of response that we got to those works. Although I am not saying that it is the be-all and end-all, but it had a place in our scholarship, it had a place in our history, it had a place in our literature. Alex Haley's Roots, it has a place. Let us look at it that way. It does. When that work was published, you know, the critics, a surprisingly number of them, came out to savage and hound Haley and even dispute the authenticity of his facts. They used the Sunday Times of England, not the one here, the one in England. And on April the 10th, 1977, a British journalist, for want of another ruder word to call him, called Mark Otway, attacked Haley's main Gambian informant. He didn't attack the Gambian informant, the Griot Keba Kanje Fofana. He attacked Fofana. And what he said he was saying that it threw serious doubts on the truthfulness and the reliability of Fofana. He was not looking for facts, Otway was not. His primary interest at the time was in destroying Fofana's credibility, and so destroying the credibility of Haley's roots. And this is what he did. But fortunately, Mark Otway did not succeed. A senior member of the Gambian Cultural Archives, Mr. Sibedi, he wrote in defense of Fofana, he said, "Reporter Mark Otway has, in order to achieve his own ends, misused the information which he got from me, attributed statements to me which I did not make, and falsely attacked the character and good name of one of Jufre's respected elders, Fofana. I think he owes both Keba Kanje Fofana and me an apology." They will never get that apology. And we do not expect apology. But that is only one book. There are many other books. Let me pick another one for you. There is the work, Diop's early work, not that present powerful one, that definitive one now, Civilization or Barbarism, which I hope my young colleague and friend will talk to you about. I think he will. The Senegalese scholar's main thesis in that early book, The African Origin of Civilization, was that historical, archaeological, and anthropological evidence supports the claim that Egypt's ancient civilization, one of the first recorded in historical writings, was actually Africoid in origin. Diop's claim was well discussed, thoroughly, using many disciplines to do it, because that was the kind of scholar. He was a multi-talented scholar. And in fact, even a Jewish critic or whatever, called Immanuel Wallerstein, in a book that he wrote called Africa, the Politics of Independence, he stated about this book, he said, about Diop's book, he says, "This bold hypothesis, which is not presented without supporting data, has the interesting effect of inverting Western cultural assumptions. For Diop argues, if the ancient Egyptians were Africoid, then European civilization is but a derivation of African achievement," which is exactly what it is.
That's right.
And one of the book's most important points is Diop's polemical and embattled rejoinder to scholars, to historians, to sociologists, etc., who made a kind of erroneous attempt to whiten ancient Egypt. That was put to rest for all time. It may not seem so now, because the same old arguments being brought up not by quote-unquote European mist scholars, no, but by journalists, by two big journalists working like hacks on the papers around the place. You know those rags they call, what do they call them, the Star and whatever. These are hacks. They know nothing about history. They are not scholars. They can only tell you they're quoting from scholars. They don't know what they're quoting. But they would add, like Sister Barbara Sizemore told us this morning, the scholars who give them the information don't want their names mentioned. That should tell you something. I know it tells all of us something. And it is this kind of scholarship that we're dealing with. Yesterday, I listened to Brother Ron Walters talking about his independent, Ron Daniel, talking about his independent bid for the presidential campaign. And one of the things he spoke about, the first thing he mentions, is that reparations for damages done to Africans by America during slavery.
All right.
That is a very important thing. In fact, it is one of the most important things that we need to be about. 1992 is the year of payment, my brothers and sisters.
Right.
Payment for Africans both at home and abroad.
Right.
It is payment centuries long overdue.
Right.
It is payment for 500 years of labor, of humiliation, of genocide on the slave hellholes of North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. It is also payment for the destruction and the underdevelopment of the continent of Africa and the Africans there who managed to escape the European slave hunters who were roaming and burning the villages and towns of Africa, hunting and looking for our ancestors to work their sugarcane and cotton prison plantation. They also, on the motherland, suffered the rape of their land and the colonial demoralization of their body and their spirit. For us then as Africans, the year 1992 is no year of the celebration of Columbus, the greatest enemy of the Indians of the Americas, and the millions of Africans who were kidnapped and shipped as cargo to this hemisphere. There, under subhuman conditions of brutality, they were penned and chained to perform as beasts of burden. Superhuman labor for Europeans who virtually wiped out all the Indian population from the tip of the Americas to the top of the Americas. They didn't miss an inch of land where Indians were. And when they did that, what did they do? Their great Franciscan priest, Las Casas, said, let us get Africans. Africans are hardy, are tough, they will be able to do the work. I don't want to have to go and tell you about Columbus, because the kind of things the Spanish did were recorded by Las Casas. They make you feel trembling even today that human beings or white beasts could perform such horrible deeds. Deeds that would make the beasts in the field ashamed. They performed it on our people, men, women, and children. We must not forget and we must not forgive. This is a Holocaust that's bigger than any Holocaust. Next year they're going to have a kind of Hollywood extravaganza about Columbus. We cannot take part. We must mourn. But we must do more than that. We must take the occasion to see that we get the reparation that is due to us. In fact, when they abolished slavery, quote unquote, in point of fact, when they were forced to abolish slavery in the Caribbean and elsewhere, they paid the plantation owners compensation, millions and millions of money, of dollars and pounds in sterling, for the loss of this unpaid labor. Even one man in Martinique, one of the leaders, Victor Chelche, had to say, you are paying the slave owners, what about the slaves? And you know what they replied? They would not know what to do with the money. The insolence, the arrogance, it is still present today. And they said, we have to educate them how to use money. A bigger lie you never heard in your life. But their history is replete through and through with lies. And to end, again, let me add the words, we have only us to sustain us. The struggle is a life struggle. We cannot give up. And let me put it with one poem. I love poems because poems tell a lot of things. And that is the truth, although they're in poetic language. And one of the brothers wrote a poem that I think we should end with. It's a memo to the Western world, you know, the world of liars and falsifiers. Yeah. And it says, while you groveled in your caves, looking for an exit, we built Kush, Nubia, Nok, Ghana, Fanti, Monomotapa, Ashanti, Zulu and Delhi, Mali, Songhai, Timbuktu, Jeli, Zimbabwe, Meru, Ethiopia, and Egypt. When you emerged and tried to stand erect, we had built pyramids and sphinx, irrigated and fertilized parched lands. And when you felt you would fall off the world if you went too far, we crossed the oceans, made friends, and influenced people.
All right.
And when you were sick and needed medicine, Imhotep shared his discoveries.
Yeah.
And when you were starved for education and civility, you came to our temples. We were your teachers. And when the Creator said, let me make human in this African place, you weren't even around.
Right.
Thank you, brothers and sisters. Thank
Hey,
you.
all right. Wonderful. 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 All right. All right. That was wonderful. As we promised you, this panel would be both informative and inspirational. And so we won't take too much time to bring on our next panelist, who many of you know. I'll introduce him as Dr. Molefi Asante. He is the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Temple University, which has the first PhD program in African American Studies in a major university. He is also the author of Kemet, Afrocentricity and Knowledge. And he's also the author of numerous other books, including his most recent book, which is Historical and Cultural Atlas of African Americans. So I'm sure that we will find this book as excellent as his other ones, and we're glad to see that he is still writing and publishing. In addition, he's also the vice president of African Heritage Studies Association, as well as a member of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, which I will pick up his membership before I leave. So to some of you, I will present to you, to others I will introduce to you, but to all of us, let us welcome Dr. Molefi Asante.
I want to thank Nzinga very much for her kindness, and I will pay my membership fee. Right. I also want to acknowledge all of my elders and also the young people who are here. I'm really happy to see so many young people.
Yeah.
That's it's really great, wonderful. And to acknowledge, just in a minute, before I make my presentation, to acknowledge Sharshi McIntyre, who has been the president of HSA during a very difficult time in which I have been mainly involved with the PhD program at Temple. And she has single-handedly done a fantastic job, and I think we deserve to give her credit. She's very generous, but we need to recognize her for what she has done. If white scientists could do what they had done in the past, say in the 19th century, and they had been listening to Brother Scobie, they would have diagnosed him as having dysesthesia Ethiopica.
And?
That was a disease that only black people had in the 19th century. The white scientists came up with a number of diseases that were specific to Africans. And one of these was dysesthesia Ethiopica. It was whenever you found rascality in Africans who didn't want to accept the words of the master. And so I would think that EdwardScobie would be a good candidate. Now, they also had another one, which they call drapetomania. And drapetomania was the disease whenever an African decided to run away from enslavement. They said that that was a sickness. Yeah. It wasn't that he or she wanted to run away and be free. They were ill. They had drapetomania, which was the flight from home madness. So we've come a long way with these falsifiers. So when I saw the topic, Greece to Columbus, I thought that you could possibly have looked at that and called it Homer to America, or you could have said 800 BC to 1492, 2,292 years of European falsification, or you could have said the period from the education of Homer to the death of Sonny Alibert. Whenever people ask me about 1492, I normally tell them the thing that I remember, which was significant to African people, was the fact that Sonny Alibert, who had tried to keep the Europeans and the Arabs out of West Africa, died. And that when he died, there was an opening of the door to all of West Africa. So what I would like to do is to explore with you just a few ideas regarding this question of Greece to Columbus. Let me start by mentioning a book that it has received some notoriety in the Africanist world. And I say Africanist as opposed to Africological or as opposed to Africana. The Africanist world is largely comprised of white scholars and occasionally many of their African graduate students. And among the leading books in that circle of thinkers now is a book by V.Y. Mudimbe, which is called The Invention of Africa. And they have celebrated that book a number of places. Now, it's a pretty good book in many cases. I mean, in many ways. I mean, there's some excellent information. And Mudimbe goes in and out of being Afrocentric. He's not clear of what his position is. Okay. But what I want to take up is this notion of the invention of Africa. Because I think it was not an invention of Africa. I mean, this is a sort of a neutral concept when you talk about invention of Africa. But rather, it was the fabrication of Africa that the Europeans were involved in. And whether you were talking about the origins of African cultures, or the question of ethics, or the question of governance, a sense of history, whatever you were talking about, you had a fabrication occurring in the writing of European historians. Now, how do we know anything? We essentially know on the basis of memory. In other words, the reason you know who you are is because you remember certain kinds of things about yourself in terms of historical moments, events, personalities, ceremonies, and so on. Well, the same way that we know ourselves individually, we also, in a cultural sense, know certain kinds of things about cultures and about societies. When we look at the European fabrication of Africa, what we have seen is an attempt to interdict the memory of African people by changing information, by changing place names, giving them new names, by calling Nyanza Lake Victoria, by calling Musiwatunya Victoria Falls, by changing the city name, the names of the cities of Africa to European-based names. All of these methods are methods at interdicting the concept of memory of the African. So what happens ultimately is that you often get the African who believes that the interdicted memory is the correct memory. So you have Africans walking around and say, yeah, I'm a Negro. Yeah. Or you have Africans walking around and say, yeah, I live in Stanleyville or Salisbury, as they did before those names were changed. And so what you have is a situation in which this crippled memory of Africa has been put forth as if it is a whole memory of a people, and it doesn't exist that way. Now look at several other notions here. Democracy and philosophy. The other day, well, it was longer than the other day, but a few months ago, a reporter from the New York Times called me and asked me about the word democracy. He says, well, don't you think that democracy is a Western concept? I told him, no. I mean, who told you that? I don't think that democracy is a Western concept. In fact, I've never seen democracy in the West. But what I told him was that the word democracy is a Western word, but the concept of people being able to make judgments and decisions about their own governance, that didn't originate with the Western people. It didn't originate with the Europeans, with the Greeks. And so when you understand that a lot of things that have happened have been simply the changing of names, the changing of concepts, or the taking of concepts, appropriating concepts, and calling them something and claiming that they belong to the European experience. And by the same token, this is what they've done, of course, with the word philosophy. And Obenga, in his major work, of course, has dealt with that question of philosophy. He's even pointed out that the word philosophy is not even a Greek word when you really get to it. That philo and sophia don't even have an origin in any Indo-European language. That they go back to Seba in the ancient Medu-Neter. So when you start looking at that, you have to raise questions, as EdwardScobie said, about everything. You gotta, every time you read a line, you have to say, well, that may not be true, or that probably isn't true. And then you write a note in the margin. That's what I do. You read the books that I read, I have all kinds of notes in the margins. All right. I just question it all. I mean, it's just amazing what they do. You can't believe it. And so what happens is that Africa becomes not a continent with culture and civilization and organized societies. It becomes a set of references. And they say, well, it's wild, it's untamed, it's savage, it's primitive, and exotic, and so on. These are a set of references in the European imagination. And if you really examine this whole question of the fabrication of Africa, you see not only the fabrication of Africa in a continental sense, but the fabrication of people from Africa. So that this is why I always say that I've traveled to Africa 18 times. I've never yet met a Negro. But they fabricated Negroes. You have people who still say they are Negroes. In fact, I just heard the other day that Russell Adams at Howard University still claims to be a Negro. So, one of the things that happened, and somebody told me this, I didn't know you ever get to this point, that when you get old enough, you can just call names and say what you want to say. I like that. It's because it keeps people honest. Because the only thing is that when you call names, you keep, the other day, Russell Adams was quoted in the Washington Post as saying that Molefi Asante believes that Afrocentricity should replace everything that is European in American society. To him, it is a religion. Well, that's nonsense. You see, but what happens is that those kinds of comments are picked up by people who run around and say, well, you see, Molefi Asante is just like Lynn Jeffries. And they go around and they say, you got Molefi Asante out here saying the same thing as Asa Hilliard and all these crazy people, and they put me, so when I see Asa and Lynn coming, I go in the opposite direction. But I come back because I know we're on the right track. We're on the right road. But that's but you have a lot of Negroes who have taken on the task of trying to explain to white people what Louis Lomax used to call years ago, he called it, they're fooling white people. They're trying to say to white people, they ain't saying what you think they're saying. They're saying something else. And this is really what they're saying. And so what is happening is that there's a transformation happening in American society in terms of education, in terms of knowledge. I mean, Barbara Sizemore has been saying it for years, and now all of a sudden, What's happened is that everything is coming together in the minds of everybody. I was in a taxi today in Atlanta, and the taxi cab driver had been Yuckanan's works, and they came before Columbus in his taxi up there so everybody could see it. I mean, this is what's happening. The transformation is happening. Everybody has it. And you see, the major idea in the European experience is the superiority of its culture and its identity. And last night I was speaking in New Jersey, and a nun said to me, she says, well, you know, we have a lot of sisters here who at this college who have gone over to Africa, and we have worked trying to raise the standards of the African people. So I said to her, what gives you the reason, sister, to assume that you're raising their standards? And she sort of said, well, the thing is that there are certain kinds of things they don't have. I said, but sister, you know, in most instances, if you're talking about ethics and morality, if you're talking about intellect, they are superior to us over here on this side. I sort of said it like that. She says, well, you know, I think that the work that the sisters are doing is good. I said, yeah, but the point is that you are making an assumption that somehow there is something in the experience that you have that causes you to go to Africa and you're going to raise the standards of people. You see, that's a superiority complex, and it goes everywhere in the West. It is a Western notion. It's a European notion. No other people in the world have that notion. It is a Western idea, and this is part of what Dr. Scobie was referring to. Everywhere you go, everything they touch, the whole idea in their minds is that somehow the technical material values of the European experience is somehow the criterion for being civilized. In fact, we know that that ain't true.
All right.
Not when you can drop bombs on a country, kill 150,000 people, and act like you just had a good meal. That's insane. It's not a part of African culture or experience that I know anything about. And I think that this notion, actually, this whole superiority notion is a locational superiority position. It's a position where they try to put themselves in a position where whatever happens, regardless, even from the time of Homer, whatever happens, they're in a position of control. And Dr. Cato at Temple has called this hegemonic, and Gramsci has also talked about this, but Cato's work about the hegemonic idea, this whole notion of European hegemony, is a very powerful concept, because anywhere they are, in any experience, it's the same thing Garvey realized when he traveled to Central America and South America. He says, everywhere I go, white folk are trying to dominate black folk. He said, now that's strange. I mean, if you're in one society, you can say, okay, well, maybe this is this is an unusual situation. They don't act like this everywhere. But when you go to every society, everywhere you are, and the European is attempting to dominate the African, then you have to raise a significant question. What is in their behavior that causes them to have to feel the need to assert domination over the African? And when you ask that question, you began to see that knowledge acquisition in the West has always been a political idea. In fact, and it's a very interesting thing, because what they do, they tell you, say, well, you know, true knowledge is not supposed to be political. So when you start writing something, particularly you see when people who are in positions where they have been oppressed begin to write something, they say, well, that's political. You know, Afrocentricity is a political idea. You know, you can't, I mean, we're looking for true, objective, theoretical information. This is a political idea. And the reason we're often placed in that kind of position is that what happens is the European sees the possibility of the African getting off of the mental plantation. See, if you get off the mental plantation, then a whole lot of things happen. I mean, it can be translated into economic terms. I mean, what do you think will happen if this movement succeeds to change the curricula of the major school districts in America? You're talking economics. You're talking you're talking the rewriting of textbooks. You're talking the redistribution of money, maybe from one place to another. You're talking a whole lot of stuff. That's a political talk. And when you're talking about information and knowledge and truth, as we're talking about it, they see it in political terms because they're looking at what will happen if this is allowed to happen. Well, it's going to happen anyway. Look at this. Always, the whole notion of objective knowledge favors the status quo. And it is necessary, as Donna Marimba Richards has always taught us, it is necessary to question the whole notion of Western objectivity because it ain't objective. It does not exist in that form. And the other day, Ann Wortham, speaking before the Heritage Foundation on Afrocentrism and education, she's one of the new up-and-coming Shelby Steele types. Well, she's been out there for about 10 years now, but she's a graduate of Tuskegee. She is. But she was on saying she was a colored American. She was not African or black or anything. She was colored. But at any rate, one of the things she said was that she said one of the things they're questioning objectivity. They're doing the same thing Immanuel Kant did. He questioned objectivity. Well, the point is that she did not prove or present any position to destroy or to disestablish the notion that objectivity was in fact or is in fact one of the ways that the Western status quo keeps its own status quo in place. In other words, if you can say that, then of course anybody who challenges, if you bring a challenge, you are in a negative position. Because it's impossible to bring a challenge against the status quo, you see, unless you are trying to transform it or change it or trying to upset it or trying to create a revolution. And if you do all those kinds of things, they say, well, you're not being objective, you're being political. Well, look at this. From the very beginning, with the emergence, the flowering of European information in you go back to the 15th century with and the 14th century even in Florence with the Medici family, when the Medicis of Florence, for example, sent Marsilio Ficino to the East to bring back books, and he brought those two books back, Corpus Hermeticum and Plato's Republic. And when those books were brought back, the first book that was translated into Latin was the Corpus Hermeticum. It was the Hermetic text. This was an African book that was translated into Latin. It was translated before Plato's Republic. Now, Hermes is the same deity that is also called Thoth, is also called Jehudi. Now, what happened was that later on, the fact that the Hermetic text, the Corpus Hermeticum, was translated first and was the first book that opened the doors to what was called the European Renaissance, they changed that around and made the Republic, Plato's book, the principal book of that whole period. So in a sense, the African book, the book with the African knowledge and information, did not figure later on in terms of what they began to ascribe as saying that, for example, certain kinds of forms and ceremonies came out of the Republic of Plato and out of ancient Greece, when in fact we know that most of those things that they got came out of ancient Africa. In fact, the whole ceremony, for example, of graduation and commencement, people wearing robes and so on, the whole initiates coming right out of the temples of ancient Nile Valley civilization. This was, sometimes you ask people, where did that come from? They say it came from the medieval period. Yeah, European medieval period. But it came from European medieval period. Where did they get it from in European medieval period? They got it from ancient Africa. You see, this is one of the fabrications of falsifications that occurs. But look at this. I say that this knowledge, in terms of the way the Europeans have done it, is the knowledge that we're presenting. They see it as political because, you see, what happens is that when you're on a plantation, normally, and plantations where I grew up right here in Georgia, and I remember the days when they still had some of these plantations. You thought the plantations all ended in the 1800s, but they still had some of these plantations out of the rural areas, right? And one of the things about a plantation, if you're on a plantation, they normally have people on a plantation who help to organize it and try to run it efficiently. And of course, if the master of the plantation leaves, he expects that the plantation is going to keep on running because it's in place. Everything's in place. And when he's away on vacation, he can even have an overseer on the plantation who keeps things running. People just go ahead and do what they're doing. They're on the plantation. And every person on the plantation has a job. Now, you also get on the plantation some people who are what I call aspiring overseers. And they sometimes come from your own people. They're aspiring to be overseers. You see what I'm saying? But what happens is that when you are on that plantation and you have been given instruction to plow in a certain field, you normally, if you're following the plantation rules, you plow in that field. But occasionally, you get some Africans who have dysesthesia ethiopica. They decide that, hey, I ain't plowing in that field. I'm going to plow in the field over there. Well, then you got trouble. You see what I'm saying? And essentially what's happening now in the intellectual arena is that you got a situation where you got all these African men and women running around here with dysesthesia ethiopica. And people are saying, oh, we got a whole lot of crazy Africans running around here trying to change things. And that, of course, has frightened and upset the intellectual establishment in this country. That's why you have all those people writing all those articles trying to deal with this problem. They can't deal with it. They can't put this one back in the bottle. It's impossible to do so. Too many people have the knowledge. Too many people are reading. Too many people are studying. You can't put it back in the bottle. It ain't going to go back in the bottle. And this is the issue that is confronting everybody now. And I think that one of the principal reasons why this has happened is what I call actually civilization jealousy. The Europeans found in Africa the most monumental and majestic civilization of antiquity. And the question is, how do you steal it? And I mean, I really mean this. I mean this in a serious sense. I mean, you know, the question is, look at this. No other people in the history of the world that I know of, now if you know of some, correct me if I'm wrong, no other people attempted to carry off as much of any other place other than their own as Europeans. You know what I'm saying? Look at this. That's right. And got other people to steal for them when they couldn't get their hands on it. Look at this. I was a student at UCLA, and the curator of the African Art Museum took me down into the basement of Haynes Hall and opened up drawers and drawers of Yoruba art. The UCLA has like 2,000 pieces of Yoruba sculpture. I was shocked. I was like, wow. I mean, how can you get all this stuff? I mean, where do you get all this? I mean, how are you going to do this? And then, of course, same people turn around and say, there's no culture in Africa. Well, you know, you brought it all over here, put it all in your museums, right? But it's been a whole process of carrying away. I mean, when you talk about the Nile Valley, it would be incredible what they tear away. And I'm not even talking, I mean, of course, the most important thing they took away, they took us away. But I'm talking about they took sculptures. They took whole temples. Whole temples. The Temple of Dendera is in the museum in New York. I saw it. They took a whole temple. They take temples. They took not only temples, but the walls of buildings. I've seen walls of buildings, great obelisks. I mean, if you go to Paris, London, New York, I mean, everywhere the Europeans have robbed. Material possessions of other people, have just taken jewelry, anything you can think of, papyri, anything they could pick up, broken glass, anything, just take it back and put it in their museums. They have become, in a sense, in their own countries, in these countries, the repositories of someone else's contributions to world civilization. In the 15th century, the time of the European slave trade, and we always like to say in an Afrocentric way, you call it the European slave trade because it wasn't an African trade at all. It was the European slave trade. They also did something else, and I've just read up on this, and I found this. I mean, you probably knew it. I didn't. But, of course, they robbed thousands of mummies. These were dead people. They took thousands of, have no respect for ancestors, certainly not. And in fact, even in this country, with the Native Americans, you've seen it all over the land where they have dug up the sacred graves of the ancestors of our Native American brothers and sisters. But they took mummies. And I went to the British Museum, and there's a whole floor in the British Museum, and they call it the mummy room. You would be, you astonish at the gall. You astonish at the capacity of human beings to do this kind of stuff. But you know what I didn't know? I didn't know that there was that during the 15th and 16th century, that they took mummies and they crushed them up, and then they took the dust of the mummies and they put it in medicine, and then they took the medicine, they drank the medicine. Do you hear what I said they did? You didn't hear what I said they did. Now, they took our ancestors for medicine. They ingested like cannibals. Can you believe that? Well, it's true. Yeah. Falsification. Now, if I were to say this, you know what they would say? Now, you know what they would say tomorrow? And maybe somebody's in here tomorrow. I know in the Atlanta paper they're going to say Asante is talking racist talk. No, I'm talking the truth. This is not. You know what I'm saying? This is not. Or they're going to run out and they're going to tell you that this is weird. It's bizarre. He just created that on his own. He was a good speaker, just standing up there, and these things just came to him. Black folk just revealed. You know what I'm saying? That we just make up all this stuff, right? I know we are geniuses, but we ain't that smart. You know what I'm saying? No, you get this from reading, and they write about it. That's the other thing. They tell a whole lot on themselves. They write about it. There's a book called The Discovery of Egypt. Oh, I got this information out of there. That they crushed mummies up, and it became a rage, a tremendous rage throughout Europe. People wanted to have some mummy dust so they could take these Africans into their system. And get some sexual problems. Yeah. That was the other part of it. Well, I'm going to get to the ISIS in a minute. All right. But yeah. And so the Rhine papyrus, the Moscow papyrus, they're all in the European museums. Intellectual robbery was the most devastating, however. Now I'm talking about the material robbery, I'm talking about the stealing of Africans, the stealing of people, but the most devastating was perhaps this intellectual robbery. Because one of the things that happened with the intellectual robbery is they also stole our brains often away from us. So we didn't know. For example, I always tell people, when Leonardo Fibonacci brought numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to Europe, the Europeans, they didn't have numbers. They used slash marks for 1, 2 slashes for 2, 3 slashes for 3, and so on. They used Roman numerals. When Leonardo Fibonacci went to Africa, brought the numbers back to Europe, they wanted to kill him. They thought these were mystical numbers. Something was wrong with these numbers, and so on. And then later on, of course, they falsified information about where they got the numbers from. Said they were Hindu numbers. Then they said they were Arabic numbers because the Arabs were controlling Egypt at the time. But of course, Van Sertima has shown, and other people have shown, the temples of Egypt, those numbers appear right on the temples, thousands of years ago. So what are we talking about here? I'm saying to you essentially this, that European writers and European intellectuals, whenever they have conducted a discussion on African people and the African world, they have conducted those discussions often while maintaining their racist views. And these racist views are connected to all of their philosophical views that when it comes to Africa, for most of the time, whether you take Hume, Hegel, Locke, take all of them, and they're racist. And so what you don't ever get when you're in classes and you study, they teach you about Hegel, but they don't tell you he was a racist. Or they teach you about Locke, but they don't tell you he was a racist. But all of their ideas were connected to this notion of European superiority. And even today, even in the contemporary sense, the people who run after deconstructionists, I mean, Paul De Man, for example, who was one of the outstanding so-called deconstructionists, was also known to be a great anti-Semite and a great racist. And yet, people began to say, well, these are intellectually bright people. These were people who are responsible for the condition of the world that we live in now. The other day, just yesterday, I read in the New York Times, and I do read the New York Times. Some people say they don't read I read the New York Times because it tells you a whole lot. The ozone level layer is thinning at twice the rate they thought. And then they make a universal statement. The human participation in the development of fluorocarbons has created this problem. White people have created this problem. You see what I'm saying? So the human become, these are all euphemisms. I mean, and they use this guy, universal man does such and such. What do they mean white people are doing this? That's right. This is, and this is what Michael Bradley says in his book, The Iceman Inheritance. He says everything you think of it, pollution of the ocean, the destruction of the elephants, whatever you think of that's destructive is white men and women, as Scobie said. But you don't see, but you don't see that when they tell you in the so-called universal view that the human race is responsible. Well, we're responsible in the sense that we should have stopped them, and we will stop them, because we have to in order to survive. They cannot be allowed to destroy the earth. Just a couple of more points. We raised the question of cultural studies and racism, and then and we raised that question because we want to tell the truth in terms of history. Our starting point must always be ourselves, our historical processes, our memory, and then when we understand that, we will understand that we cannot reject our past, because in rejecting your past, then you allow them to fabricate your past. And I had this discussion with somebody before. They said, well, why are we always talking about history? We're talking about history because that's how we know where we're going. And if you look at the world and you understand that Africa itself is a continent that is comprised of many civilizations and cultures, but all having commonalities. One of the beautiful things we have shown in some of the work people are doing at Temple is a commonality of African cultures. And when you see that commonality from civilization to civilization, from society to society, different names that are carried over, concepts that are carried over, it shows you the strength of the African culture. We need now, ultimately, however, a sort of geothematic approach to our own cultural restructuring. And we need to, as Fanon would say, leave Europe. And we need to leave Europe because there are two fallacies that occur when we don't leave Europe. And I call them, in the Afrocentric theory, we call them fallacies of position. And we call them fallacies of position because one fallacy is what I call the locational fallacy. That is, if you are not in the right place, you won't get the right angle to view any kind of phenomenon. If you have to be located in a centered place in terms of your own historical perspectives and experiences, if you're going to get a proper angle. And the second one I call linguistic fallacy. And it's a linguistic fallacy because people can sometimes be centered, they can be located in the right place, but they have no ability to describe what they see. So you got two kinds of things going on. Sometimes people can be off because they're out of position. They're just not even centered. They're not even, you can't even talk to them about being Afrocentric. They're not even centered at all. So they have a locational problem. But even sometimes people get the right location and they have not had enough experiences to give them the proper angle. And so finally, if we come down to one last point, really truly one last point, the Civil War. I want to mention that because I want to bring it to America. You know, remember, the Civil War, and this is again talking about location and position. The Civil War, remember, after the Civil War was over, and 4 million Africans got free, and we don't, this is again in terms of falsification, millions of people walked all over this country looking for their relatives. And it's rare that people talk about this tremendous saga. It was a tremendous saga. People remember that they had a wife or a husband or a daughter or a mother or a father or a brother or someone that they faintly remember hearing the white people talk and said they were selling this person to somebody in Texas. And so we started out on foot and went everywhere we could looking for our relatives, looking to put the pieces back together. And this is where I bring in ISIS, because one of the interesting things that ISIS did, and you know this story, and that is that when Seth killed Osiris and she scattered his body in 14 pieces throughout the land, all over the earth, she went back trying to put those pieces back together. And then later she went with Horus, her son, to help to try to reform Osiris. Now let me tell you something. African American people, we in this process. They created the law against lottering for us during the period when we were on the streets looking for our relatives. All the law, if you look at the laws that came out of Jim Crow, all of these laws were anti-family, they were anti-human, they were against Africans who were trying to do something that was humane and something that was based on the traditions of trying to keep family together. Let me tell you one other thing, because this is very, I mean, really, I am finishing, but because this is very important. When we got our freedom, and I always say when we got our freedom because 200,000 Africans fought in that war. And we need to remember that men and women fought in that war. Some were even spies. But when we got our freedom, we were freed with nothing. Nothing. Not even a thank you. Thank you, African, for working for 244 years from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. Thank you. You're free. No, not even a thank you. It's free, right? And that's why I always say, stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet brought us to the place for which our parents sighed. We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. Thank you.
All right. All right. The rear of the room, Dr. Asa Hilliard, your local. I love you, Asa Hilliard. And to continue on with this legacy and to give you a status of the position that we're in this battle to gain the hearts and the minds of the people are none other than our intellectual warrior, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. For some of you who do not know Dr. Jeffries, I just want to say one or two things about him. One is that he is the chair of the Department of Black Studies at City College, New York. Secondly, he's the past president of AHSA. Thirdly, he is the second vice president of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. But moreover, he's a warrior, he's a fighter, he's a friend of the people, he loves black people, and we love him. So I want you to stand and welcome Dr. Leonard Jeffries.
To be down here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I have some roots just like Malefe, to be home, and to be with family. And particularly, it is wonderful to be here dealing with these major questions and issues which we are now raising. So I'm glad that we have had so many young people join us.
All right.
Because the excitement of Atlanta is to be down here amongst these colleges. And we should have really gone through the doors of the dorms and brought these youngsters out here. But I'm glad to see so many here.
They'll take it back to him.
In the African tradition, nothing starts without certain ceremonies and rituals, and one of those is that your elders should give you permission to speak. And since Dr. Clark has left to go back to New York because he's speaking, and Dr. Ben is getting ready for the evening, our elder, Asa Hilliard, we are asking for permission to proceed. I saw Asa slip in. I just saw a shadow. I didn't even see a full-faced figure. I saw a shadow, head down to toe, and I knew he was here. I felt the light and the presence. But Asa has been a stalwart giant in the struggle. He will continue as long as the ancestors and the Almighty Architect of the universe gives him the power, and Pat, his wife, allows him to go forth.
Thank you.
But unless there is something coming up under him, that which he has brought forth is not going to have the meaningful fruit that it should have. So the beauty of our togetherness is that there are brothers and sisters coming up under us. I see these young sisters sitting in the front.
Beautiful.
With their head tied, making a statement. I think they need to stand so we can let them know we understand their statement. When I came in yesterday, they were going through a ritual and a ceremony. And it was very beautiful. You could feel the light and the power. But the female principle can't go forth and bring forth life and sustain it without the male principle. And I understand there is an African fraternity here.
Yes.
Are any of the brothers of that particular fraternity Kemet here? If they are, let me see them. Now we have a whole host of youngsters who have bonded themselves in a fraternal and a sororal way. When we went for lunch in Thayer Hall, I saw the alphas. And so those who are in these fraternal and sororal orders, could you all please stand so we can see and feel you?
All right.
Alphas, omegas, kappas, deltas.
All right.
It is about bonding. in a very meaningful way
That's right.
in the context of the African family. So those who have decided to make that choice are in the best traditions of our people.
Yes, they are.
So we need to acknowledge that. As they grow and develop and bust out of the constraints of Negro achievement into the full flowering of Africanness,
Yeah.
you'll be surprised how those bonds will grow.
Yeah.
Negro achievement brought us this far,
All right.
and it's the foundation upon which we stand. But it is not equipped to take us into the 21st century.
That's right.
So we've got to bust beyond.
That's right.
And it's not just the fraternities and the sororities. It is the churches. It is the fraternal orders, Masonics and Eastern Star. It is
That's right.
our community organizations. We have to begin to seriously Africanize. And why? Because it is through this knowledge of Africa and African values and African consciousness that a true transformation of the mind, body, and spirit will take place. And you have to begin to understand that. That's why when Molefi said he saw the cab driver making a statement, it's happening all over the country. I can't go no place. They put me up to be slaughtered April the 20th last year when the New York Times published some mess about two racist professors at City College. One saying that whites were superior because of some test, and one saying that Africans were superior intellectually and culturally because of melanin.
And the truth.
And they went on to say that this particular professor talking about melanin was an anti-Semite, had nerve enough to say that the ancient Hebrews owed a debt to the Africans,
More truth.
that the swastika was older than the ancient Hebrews themselves and was a Sun People symbol, that rich Jews had been involved in not only the development of Europe, but the enslavement of Africans and the financing of the slave trade. And once you have been branded anti-white, anti-Semitic, a crazy intellectual has some theories about ice people, the cradle of the north, and sun people, the cradle of the south, you are supposed to have been dead and gone. 50 major media descended upon me and wanted to know what it was that I was saying. Some of them went into our classes, CNN, BBC, British Broadcasting Company. I said, you missed me. I was in London for 14 days lecturing all over the place. Canadian Broadcasting Company, Australian Nightline, all of these descended upon me, looking to find out whether I'm saying black people are superior because of melanin and because of their intellectual and cultural development, physical development. And I said, no, we talk about difference, not superiority or inferiority. That's a European frame of reference. And we do say, however, vive la différence, as the French would say, long live the difference.
All right.
But what we are saying is that there is an African origin of humanity.
Yes.
There is an African evolution of this humanity on this planet. And there's an African sustained and fundamental cradle of civilization. And it is this process that has laid the foundations for civilization and high culture for the world. That's what we're saying. And if you wish more, I'm available. Every major media ran away, including Ebony Magazine Jet. Every major media, except one obscure Jewish press in Hackensack, New Jersey, called the Jewish Standard. They're the only people who said, do you have data, information, documentation to base your theses and hypotheses on? And I said, do you think I would be the master teacher and scholar that I am if I did not have these things? So they wanted to investigate and check out these things. So I went to the Jewish Standard, Main Street in Hackensack.
Okay.
I rolled up with my rollers and boxes and bags of books and documents. I stayed there and laid down the case for Africanness for 3 hours. After the third hour, they got cognitive dissonance. They couldn't handle it anymore. But I was on a roll with the African Holy Ghost, and I could not stop. So I continued for another hour, even though I know I had lost them.
3 hours.
And to their credit, this Jewish Standard wrote a 2-page article on what I had said. To this day, I have not read the article. I acknowledge and credit them with the courage and the justice of asking to become called in and writing an article. I don't care what it says. New York Times has never called me and asked seriously what I am saying. U.S. News and World Report, Atlantic Magazine, Reader's Digest just called a couple of weeks ago and said they're going to republish the article that was in Atlantic Magazine about political correctness. And I said, be careful, because you may have to see my lawyer. They said, that's why we're calling. Because we're not going to publish anything that you have said you have not said. And then I ran down and said, a lot of that stuff, and most of it is BS. And so we'll see what the Reader's Digest does. But very few people have come to me and asked what we are doing. Not one scholar has challenged us. It's only been these crazy, insane newspaper people, as Dr. Asante and Professor Scobie was mentioning, and our beautiful sister, Dr. Barbara Sizemore, outlined earlier today. The scholars are in hiding because they know we stand on an African truth backed up by the most devastating scientific and historical data. Science and history is on our side. As quiet as it's kept, outstanding Jewish scholars have had the courage to send me their books and documents supporting our position. Jewish scholars have called me supporting the position on rich Jews being involved in the enslavement of Africans. Most Jews were poor Slavs in their shtetls in Europe, without a pot to pee in like most other Europeans. We're not talking about most Jews. We're talking about those who became the grandees of Spain, those who moved into Amsterdam and with an alliance with the Protestants of Amsterdam, erected the slave system that was an international endeavor involved in by all Europeans, the Danes, the Dutch, the Brandenburg Germans, the Swedes, established by the Catholic Church and sustained by the Protestant Reformation. And we've got to understand that. One Professor Berger called me up. He said he's a retired professor from SUNY. He's not related to that Berger attacking me. He was calling me, give me information on the Jews' involvement in the slave trade, rich Jews' involvement in the slave trade, helping to set up the Dutch East Indian Company, the Dutch West Indian Company, the Portuguese Company, and all the other Brazilian Company. And then he said he wanted to give me some little side information on the blackness of the Statue of Liberty. This is a Professor Berger. Sister, you cannot try the ancestors. You done come back from the dead many times, and let's not try the ancestors. Sister Shasti's having trouble negotiating that seat there. At any rate, what I am saying to say is that Dr. J is alive and well. Instead of him being destroyed, I'm thanking the New York Times for making me a folk hero among my people. I want to thank them for giving me an international platform. I could not have purchased no amount of money. I could have hooked up Oprah Winfrey and the Cosby and even asked Michael Jackson and Toyota to give me a bit of their money. And I couldn't have bought this international platform that they have given us to speak our particular truth. And we're going to speak it. The data and the information is there. And it's in every form that you want. It is in the oral tradition Dr. Milano Krangle was beaten up a little bit on the oral tradition today, but it is in the oral tradition. That's part of our cultural legacy of passing down the word by word of mouth. It's in the raps. The rappers are now raising issues that you couldn't get anybody to raise. Smokey never raised the issue that the rappers are raising. You couldn't get Diana Ross to shake her butt around an issue of significant Africanness. But the rappers are raising it. We've got to get the rappers to go deeper into an understanding. But they're raising the issues and spreading it in the culture. And one rapper might produce a tape and be surprised as it might be, 500,000 of our people will have it in a couple of weeks. So let's not poo-poo the rappers and their oral tradition. In fact, in New York, we're working with them in our workshops and whatnot to make their content real. But it's in the tapes. These brothers are not here with these burning lights and dragging this material around because this is what they want to do, because there's some money to be made here, that there's profiteering. They are in the process of taking high-tech European-ness and using it to transmit the knowledge across this land. And it's working. I was in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and a brother and sister came to me in the Hotel Hilton, and they was all excited, come up to me like they had known me all their life. I didn't know who they was. They grabbed me, hugged me, kissed me. And then they realized that I don't know who they are, so they stopped. And they said, Dr. J, we just want to thank you. I said, well, thank you, welcome. What is it? The brother was saying that he had my tape. I said, well, thousands of people have it, but which particular tape are you talking about? And it was a tape that he got from Amherst College. That one of the brothers there, and I've spoken at Amherst for 3 or 4 years in a row, so I didn't know which one of those tapes, but whatever tape that Leander Gray and the young students there who asked me to come up to Amherst, whatever tape they passed on to him, the man is using it, transforming his youngsters. He said he took the tape, he synthesized the information, made it palatable for the students he was dealing with, went into the classroom of a black school and came away with 25 letters from these students. He says it works. There's an excitement about our truth that stimulates the intellect and makes people achieve that we're not achievers in the mind's eye of a whole lot of people. And so I told the brother, do what you will with the tape, but write me a letter that this is what happened. Send me some copies of those letters so we can use this for our people, because many of them are questioning whether this is going to work. The Board of Education here in Atlanta, there's too many question marks there. Negro achievers on the board who want to know whether this is going to work or not. Same thing in Washington, D.C., in Newark, New Jersey, other places. We've got to convince our own people. The system has decayed and rotted, and young, bright youngsters, 5 or 6, come into a classroom, and by 8 or 9, their minds are brain damaged because of the process. And we have people questioning. We need any port in any storm. But you cannot lose with the stuff that Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and the rest of us have been using. You cannot lose with this stuff because it is so devastating in terms of destruction of white supremacy and so elevating in terms of our particular truth. Clemson Brown and others have pulled together an encyclopedia of tape material that you need to tap into. Africa, the Light of the World, Transatlantic Productions Video Catalog. Some of it's very expensive. That's when you try to get it into a school system or into your school library. Some of it will be available for you as you bring this knowledge to your homes and to your communities, to your fraternities. Shelby Lewis's son was saying that he has taken the tape when we were in New Orleans, and he's meeting with youngsters around the tape, spreading this knowledge. You've got to form the study groups, the research teams. You've got to put the knowledge in our community, because as quiet as it's kept, white folks are not going to allow you to put this knowledge in the school system without an enormous fight. It was clear to me when they raised hell around this little innocuous document, the Curriculum of Inclusion, which isn't even a curriculum. It's a critique of the existing curricula of the state of New York. We were asked to bail the state of New York out of a dilemma. They couldn't evaluate the curriculum of the state of New York. Catastrophes had been set up. There was no report that had come out, so they begged me, could you please come into the process, sacrifice some of your time to help us get a report done? And they asked 4 of us, Dr. Hume, an Asian woman at Hunter College, to look at it from the Asian American perspective, Dr. Fratricelli Rodriguez to look at it from the Puerto Rican and Latino perspective, Professor White to look at it from the Native American perspective, and Dr. J, myself, to look at it from the African American perspective. All 4 of us took upon ourselves over 100 documents. I was smart enough not to try to do it by myself. I had Dr. Shashi McIntyre, Dr. Doug Davidson, Dr. Professor Scobie, and a whole others that helped me with looking at this material. And all of us concluded, the 4 consultants and myself and the people I work with, none of us having ever met. I never met the 4 consultants. We never communicated. All of us separately agreed that there were over 100 documents of the state of New York did not reflect in any serious way the meaningful presence of our people on the globe, and that there needed to be changes. But the political process started when the attacks came, and they singled me out as the person to be slaughtered on the altar of the curriculum revisions. It didn't work. That's what the New York Times article was all about. Set them up to destroy them. In the New York Times article, they mentioned that this Jeffries is a serious question because he is the major consultant for the New York State curricula. And the vote was supposed to come up the week after the article. And if it wasn't for our sister, our powerful sister, Dr. Adelaide Sanford, the Regent of New York, who got on her knees and asked the ancestors, what road should she take? She was feeling a little sympathy for me, knowing that I had been asked to do a favor for the state of New York, and here I was being slaughtered, and she thought maybe we should end this whole process. But the ancestors spoke to her on her knees. Now, the sister tells us that they said, continue to struggle until victory is at hand. Do not give up. And the sister went into the Board of Regents and did battle, and as a result, the Board of Regents' vote was 17-0 to make changes in the curriculum. And they brought in Dr. Hillian and others to evaluate these things, and of course, you only hear about Miss Daisy, Diane Rabich. But Asa was a part of the process of evaluation. But it's only as if it was one person, Diane Rabich. Miss Daisy. Her promotion is all right. Asa says she needs to be in the bureaucracy. Maybe it'll choke her to death and she'll leave us alone. You see, you have to understand and balance these things out. There's always a negative and a positive in the universe. But what we are trying to say is that you are particularly blessed, this generation of Africans, and these several generations. Nobody before you has had the foundation that has been laid for you. Malcolm didn't have the understanding of Africanness that is now available to you. And Nkrumah did not have the understanding of the significance of the African continent, the African value system that is available to you. W.E.B. Du Bois, genius, scientist, did not have the knowledge that is available to you. Marcus Garvey, with his great vision of Africa, could not have envisioned an African world into the 21st century that you can envision. There is a historical moment that you have been a part of. We have laid foundations that you can build on in an unusual way with the explosion of technology if you tap into it. Wed this explosion of technology with the ancient knowledge that's being reworked for you. There's no way that anybody can stand in your way, because the European has set up a death and dying track for himself. Falsification of history has created an educational process for him that's a dead end. If you cannot see the global world community and relate to it and its significance, you can't function on the globe into the 21st century. The Bushman was able to get his game over last month, but it's not going to work down the road in the next few years. In fact, I'm glad the game was played out so that Africans can understand that no matter how much military armor you purchase from the Europeans, that victory cannot be won. But if you arm yourself with the mental armor that our scholars are bringing forth, there's no way anybody can stop you.
That's right.
We have our neutron bombs, our missiles, our atomic bombs. You've got to find them. But you can't find them if all of you set for yourself is Negro achievement. You can't find them if all you want to make yourself into and transform yourself into is an Afropean. You can't find them if your limitation is Alpha, Phi Alpha, or Omega Psi Phi, which has you seeing your brothers not as brothers that you need to link with, as blocks in the new African pyramid, but as rivals. You cannot see it if Christianity tells you that your brand of Christianity is only the brand of Christianity that's going to save the world. Africans laid down another concept of brotherhood and sisterhood that had you seeing not only every brother and sister as extensions of yourself, but everything in the universe, every bird, every bee, every tree, every beetle, even the dung beetle as part of the universal God consciousness. That we are an extended African family, and that's how you structure your social systems. That you see the spiritual universe not only within the human family, but in this planet, but in the cosmos. There are universal systems that are people, but you cannot limit yourself to the parameters of a European standard. It is a dead end. They've sold you a bag of goods. Open up the bag, there ain't nothing in there. Even if you got a PhD from Stanford, Columbia University, or Atlanta U, there ain't nothing in there if Africa is not at its center. The secret weapon emerged. Dr. J has kept his mouth shut for the past years and taken a battering from all these nuts and all these, because I was waiting, we were trying to perfect the weapon, we was getting it together. I didn't know whether it would ever come out of his trials and his tribulations, but it has emerged. The secret weapon has arrived. Dr. Diop's magnificent synthesis of his challenge to European intellectual tradition, civilization, barbarism, is here. And if you don't have a copy of this, you're not equipped to struggle the way you should be struggling. The lie and falsification of European history cannot stand up under this scientific and historical truth. You've got to have this and study it. When you go home and you go to your dorms or wherever you're going to go, move that King James version of the Bible over and put this near it, on top of it. Move that Quran over and put this near it, on top of it. And then after you start pulling this out and working with this, then you need to reach and grab a hold of the whole school of thought that Dr. Ben has institutionalized and put in print. Black Man of the Nile and his family. Africa, the mother of Western civilization. Africa, the origin of the major Western religions. These are the things you've got to have on your night table. These are the things you've got to go to sleep with. Move that King James version of the Bible over. And whatever revised and whatever other version is there. And although Dr. Malana Karanga was telling us we need to publish more, which we certainly need to do, you are tapping into whole schools of knowledge of books already published. Carter G. Woodson stands as a whole school of knowledge in and of himself. Not only his own books, but that which he allowed other scholars to publish in the Journal of Negro History. There's a whole school of knowledge that was produced out of his spirit. There's a whole school of knowledge that's in here in the Woodruff Library that Du Bois produced when he was here in Atlanta University with Byline magazine. There's a whole school of knowledge in his own work, starting with his PhD on the suppression of the slave trade, the Philadelphia Negro. He did even a microscopic manuscript on my mother's hometown in Virginia, Farmsville, Virginia. He not only did a masterpiece of Philadelphia, but he did a microscopic analysis of a small black community in Farmsville. There's a whole school of knowledge that comes out of the brother. And certainly Marcus Garvey had things written, not only about him, but things he wrote and published in his newspaper, The Negro World. So I'm saying that we have been writing, but we need to tap into this explosion of technology to write even more. We're waiting for the major work to come out from Dr. Asa Hilliard. We're waiting for the major work to come out from Professor EdwardScobie. We're waiting for the major work to come out from Dr. Barbara Sizemore. We're waiting for the major work to come out from Len Jeffries. And it will be coming with your help and your assistance. People like Shashi McIntyre, they got publishing on their brain. and they're trying to put in place the facility, the capability for us to publish. And then as we publish, we can get you all to publish. What are you saying, Dr. Jake? How can these students publish? They ain't got no foundation to publish nothing on. I went into a bookstore, Lashina Books, the other day, and I'm looking down at purchasing the books because Brother Small is opening a bookstore in New York, and I see a book here with a little beautiful sister on the cover, and it's about her African experience. The preteen child of Tony Browder is published when she went to the Nile Valley. I don't know whether it was with Asa or whomever. The sister or Tony took a trip. He was able to institutionalize for children her experience in the great temples and pyramids in the Nile Valley. So if it can be done for a youngster, 8 or 9 years old, it certainly can be done for you out here trying to develop your mind and your spirit and your body so that you can be used in the service of African redemption. So that we are lucky now that the material is out. But let me try to provide a framework because the explosion of information is there and you've got to be able to tap into it. So as don't look at your watch, Shashi. As Dr. Clark says, that's my introduction. Now we can get into the main course. From Greece to Columbus, on to Malcolm. When we take that theme, we have to understand what we're talking about. Greece, this enormity of European culture and civilization, is the epitome of the falsification of history. Read not only the work of our African scholars, read Dr. Martin Burnell's book on Black Athena. And what he does is support the challenges that had been made by outstanding scholars at Howard. Dr. Chancellor Williams, who talked about the destruction of African civilization, the invasion waves that came in. And the Greeks were not the first. The Hyksos come in. Then the Libyans come in. Then the Syrians come in. Then the Persians come in. And the Greeks are mercenary troops of the Persians. And then the Greeks come in under Macedonia. A whole process of attacking African culture. And then the great Leo Hansberry was supporting the thesis of an African civilization in the Nile Valley around Ethiopia, Kush, as well as the zenith in Egypt, and it being the foundation of Greek civilization. These brothers stand as an enormous truth against the lie that Frank Snowden wants to hold on to about what Greece was all about. Here's Frank Snowden. He was dead and dying, but because of this international controversy over the truth of the significance of the African foundation of the human experience, they've resurrected him up out of the closet. Now he's on Nightline, Donohue's show, at conferences, etc. They want to posture him against Dr. Asa Hilliard and others. Snowden, who says that yes, there was a black presence in relationship to Greece, and he mastered that. He studied it. He wrote about it. He taught it. And he has held on to it like it's the gospel. And he refuses to see the larger ramifications of the relationship of Greece to Africa. It's an unfortunate mind concept that he has epitomized. This is what I'm talking about. Achieving Negro-ness. Being unable to break out of that particular box. Yes, he wrote great, outstanding works. Yes, he could see the relationship between the blackness of Africa and Greece. Yes, he packaged it, and yes, he put it in his classes. But instead of him seeing it as a window on the world, through which Africans that he was teaching could see and then be inspired to bust down the wall and go in and see the real deal, he thinks he had the real deal. He poo-poos and defames the Dr. Clarks, the Dr. Benz, the Dr. Diops, the Dr. Asa Hilliards, the Dr. Chancellor Williams, the Dr. Van Sertimers. He's against the flow of truth. And why is he holding on so tenaciously? Achieving Negro-ness has allowed him to do that. But we have to see the fullness of Greece. What was Greece all about? And as I mentioned before, you have to have in your mind's eye, the pyramidal relationship of bodies of knowledge. We're trying to take the explosion of knowledge and give you formulations, paradigms, hypotheses, and frameworks for processing this data. Your minds are computers. You've got to have a process and a plan, a program to input the computer so that the processing in the computer can take place and the output can be what you need. But if you only have the European dimension, then your processing and your programming is not going to produce the results. Pyramidal analysis and pyramid consciousness came about because the explosion of knowledge and information was such that we had to come up with a formula for processing it. Pyramidal analysis means that we need to take back our pyramids. But more important than that, we need to use this formulation, the polarities, to deal with the processing of information. At one polarity is the thesis. At another polarity is the antithesis. And as you interrelate the bodies of information between the polarities and searching for truth and knowledge, you process it, synthesize it, and go to the top of the pyramid to synthesize the information and become synthesizers. We hope that as you develop your minds and bodies in these institutions, that you become African synthesizers. Synthesizing the information and knowledge in such a way that you become African VIPs. Not Negro VIPs, in the European sense, very important person, African VIPs, understanding that that V stands for African values, that the I stands for African interest that you are prepared to die and sacrifice for, and that the P stands for principles that have been the foundation principles of the civilizing processes of the world. We want you to become synthesizing African VIPs, using your computer to process this information, and then developing the courage to go forth with this African truth, like our great scholars have done before you, the Dr. Clarks, Dr. Benz, and the whole host of us that have come up under them. But as you link the polarities and you synthesize, you have to see a systems relationship. So around the polarities, the triangularity of the pyramid, you have to put a circle representing systems. Because systems is what it's all about. This university complex is a system, but because it can't see its Africanness, it could not synthesize itself into a true African center of learning in the tradition of the Ipit Temple along the Nile. Africans have taught us that you can have divisions and you can have differences, but they do not have to be the type of differences and divisions that prevent you from linking up. That's right. Africans in the Nile knew that there were different cultural mixes in the Nile, and they institutionalized them in the tradition. So you had an upper and lower Nile. You had a Tamari and a Nahesi. But you had one unified African nation with 2 or 3 divisions institutionalized for respect for difference. That's right. You had a great temple built along the Nile. And in the temple, the pillars of the temple included that difference. One set of pillars representing the papyrus, another set of pillars representing the lotus flower, representing the difference between north and south. But the difference was unified in a temple of learning and spiritual transformation. So we can't have the difference between Clark Atlanta, the difference between Morris Brown, the difference between Spelman, the difference between Morehouse be a true division. You have to see yourselves as complementing yourselves in a temple of learning here in the center of Atlanta. And as you see the systems relationship around the polarities of the pyramid, you have to see an inner core, a circular inner core of values that are the inner core of values of the culture and civilizing processes of the world. When we talk about multicultural education, we're not talking about equality of cultures and civilization. When we raise the question of looking at the plurality of the human experience, immediately they say, what about the Eskimos? Yes, the Eskimos were significant, but you can't put them at the center of the multicultural process. At the center of the multicultural process is Africanness. Other things are peripheral to it. It's Africanness that begets multiculturalism ethnically and genetically. We are the foundation race of the human experience. Everybody else is a multicultural genetic mutation off of our genes. So when you're going to talk about multiculturalness, you're going to put the African at the center. And as you deal with the humanity of humankind, which is what Diop talks about in the first part of his book, the African monogenetic origin of humankind, with documentation that's irrefutable, including the falsification that the Europeans were involved in creating, for example, the Piltdown hoax and a whole host of other things to give themselves some ancient roots because they don't have it. Their roots go back to the caves of Europe 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. They weren't involved in the dawn of humankind. Diop outlines that 6 early humankind emerged out of Africa. The first 3 never left Africa. And then the next 3, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and Homo sapien, marched out of Africa and peopled the world. And when we get to the stage of Homo sapien sapien, whatever that is, which a European wanted to say that emerged in China, that emerged in Europe, Dr. Diop is saying all of it, no matter where it emerged, was African. Because the African was in China when Homo sapien sapien made his move on the globe. The African was in Europe when Homo sapien sapien made his move on Europe. The African was in the islands of the Pacific. And the European has to take a back seat in African multiculturalism in terms of the emergence of the human family, in terms of the biological sciences, in terms of the psychological and social sciences. The African is at the center. And then when you talk about values, you can't put a comparison of values of some obscure group compared to African values. African values are at the core of the civilizing process of the world. Do you think that the Greek synthesis that became Greek civilization could have occurred without African values? No. When we talk about early Greece, we have to see African foundations to the culture of Greece. That's what Diop is trying to say, and that's what Dr. Ben and others have been trying to say. That's what James was saying in The Stolen Legacy. There was no Greek miracle. Bernal was saying it was a blatant falsification, a racist falsification that has its roots 200 years ago, at the turn of the century in the 1800s. Falsifying Greece. If you want to understand Greece, you've got to have a timeline in your mind that Dr. He and others have been working on. If you understand Greece, you've got to put a chronology of dates and make sense. You have to have in your mind 525 in order to process Greece. 525 is when the Persians invaded the Nile Valley as one of those Persian invading waves, the Syrians and the Libyans and the Hyssopes. When the Persians invaded, they used Greek marathon troops. And then these Greek marathon troops had access to the Nile Valley as payment for the dirty work that they were doing for the Persians. Before that, Greeks had to come in and sit at the feet of the Africans, and they had to have a passport. We had to screen them. We had to check out whether they were mentally sound, whether they were physically diseased. We just didn't let them walk into the Nile. But they came. Thales came. Anaximander came. Anaxagoras came. Pythagoras came for 22 years, and a whole host of others. But 525 BC, their armies were able to come in. The diseased armies of the European, diseased mind, body, and spirit of the European Greeks. But they're coming into the Nile Valley, the antithesis coming into the synthesis, coming into the thesis, the foundation of Africanness, produced a synthesis that was Greek civilization. There's no foundation for Greek civilization out of the African foundation. The Greeks did not have writing until they came in contact with African culture civilization. The homes of Poma were still being circulated in Greek city-states by word of mouth in the 800 AD. Africans had a writing system for thousands of years before that, writing about mathematics, writing wisdom texts, writing about medicine. That's what Dr. Karang was saying. We've got to master these texts that were there. You can't have a literary class in these college systems, and they aren't dealing with the first people to emerge with the whole array of writing that our people produce. And so you've got to challenge your teachers. But then you've got to do something serious. You can't just mouth it. You've got to go find the books. You've got to find the Epper's Medical for Fires. You've got to find the Written Mathematical Pies. You've got to go get Van Sertima's book. This is a book that's very important, along with the books of Dr. Ben and Dr. Diop. Van Sertima produced Egypt Revisited. This book represents a whole generation of scholars up under Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, and Dr. Diop. A whole generation. Then you can see the antithesis. What Dr. Diop does is he lays it out. There's no Greek philosophy. How come they put all their philosophers either in jail, forced them to commit suicide, exiled them? If they were teaching a Greek philosophy, they were teaching a synthesized version of the African philosophy of the mystery educational system. And the mysteries was no mystery. The mystery was the educational process, systematically and scientifically put in place by the Africans to raise one up to the level of God consciousness in these great institutions. And you had to do it over a period of years, and you had to do it systematically, guided by master teachers. You had to do it within the context of a personal relationship with the master teachers. You couldn't do it with the so-called objective looking at books and mastering the knowledge yourself, because knowledge is not transferred in a meaningful way unless there is the socializing function of knowledge taking place, which means character development to connect with the tooling function of knowledge, which means skills development. And that's where we have a major problem in our educational processes today, because they have us focusing on tooling and skills development as the key to what education is going to be. And Dr. Nobles and Dr. Sizemore were trying to say there's a whole process that is in place before tooling takes place, and that is character development. That's why Africans, from before the womb until after the tomb, controlled the socialization process. So the knowledge was not transferred to people who didn't have character, because a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and a lot of knowledge is an enormity and a mistake if the person does not have the character by which to use the knowledge and see that they are trustees of their people's spiritual well-being, and that knowledge should be used for the sacrifice and development of their people. That's why we put brotherhoods and sisterhoods in place, not for you to play games, not for you to have step shows, not for you to have false pride, but to understand that you are organizing in vehicles for socializing, transmitting values of upliftment and sacrifice so that you can create new dimensions of transformation of self. That's what our people left. That's the core values of Africanism. It is not in the European. The European value system is a value system based upon materiality, based upon property. He cannot see and understand the Spirit. If he wants to see and understand the Spirit, he comes to us. Do you think Jimmy Swaggart really saw and understand the Spirit? He did not. He was trying to make some money. But he had a few black sisters there to give him the Spirit in his course. And then he got revealed. They stripped him and they found out he had no testicles. Running a game on religion and taking your money. And we were some of his strongest supporters because we believe in spirit. European can't process spirit. Spirit is a part of the dimension, mind, body, and spirit. It's a unity that allows for one to transform oneself. That's what they taught in the great institutions. That's what the Greek philosophers were trying to get across. And their people said, this is garbage. If you can't count it, you can't measure it. As Dr. Nichols says, then it don't exist. And the Africans are saying the Spirit exists if you cannot see it. That's their concept of God. Ra is hidden and unseen, but he's there. He's there to keep you accountable to a higher law, the Mahatian concept of the Africans. That's how the basic philosophical concept of the Europeans' law and whatnot came about. They don't have a foundation in their culture. Their culture is based upon property. Everything is property. Even marriage is property. Women marries, men, that's a property contract relationship. African value system is that a spirit force in the female unites with the spirit force in the male, and they unite with the ancestral spirit forces that each of their families come together, and you produce this catalyst and synthesis of African spirit force to lay the foundations for the family. There's no question of property. You may bring in a few little gifts here and there just to acknowledge the spiritual relationship, but the center of it is a spiritual relationship. That's the core of our value system. I just saw it alive and well in Ghana last month when I went to a festival called the Ekwesi Festival, in which the golden stool of the Ashanti Nation was brought out. And I wanted to be there. I sacrificed everything to be there. I told my students, forget it, I'm going to Ghana. They said, you're not going to teach us. We can't do it without you. I said, you're going to do it without me for a week this time. And they had this material object, the golden stool, around which a myth and legend has been created, that it was brought down from the heavens by the priest Akomfanochi to be the synthesizing principle for the Ashanti peoples, to be the symbol of authority and respect and accountability. A material object was transformed into a soul force and a spiritual being that still is alive and well. The ceremony that I witnessed was the bringing forth of the golden stool. And the golden stool does not come out unless it is preceded by the Queen Mother Priestess. Then the stool comes out, and after the stool, the king comes out. And so you see the combination of the male principle being brought forth by the female principle, being held up by the soul principle. The African trinity of the male, the female, and the spirit. And that trinity that you've inherited, that you're going to pay homage to tomorrow, is a perversion of the African trinity of the male principle, the female principle, and the Holy Ghost. And what they translated for you was around the principle of the northern cradle, which is the patriarchal principle. So you have the Father, the Son, and the male Holy Ghost. There is no role for females in the spiritual processes of this European Christianity that you have. You've got to understand what it's all about. And following Greece was Rome. And they institutionalized a religious system based around property. That's the first rise of Europe, the Greco-Roman period. And there is no first rise of Europe unless you see the African foundation. But because the Europeans didn't have the spiritual strength to sustain their institutions, when they closed the so-called educational system, the mystery system, when the Emperor Theodorus and others shut down the African institutions that they had tried to assimilate, the light went out in Europe, and the Dark Ages was brought upon them for 1,000 years. They didn't have any direction. They was in monasteries playing with each other.
Still.
The light for Europe the second time also came from Africa. As Professor Scobie was trying to point out, and he has in his writings, and he's writing on the Moors, the African Arab peoples in Spain, as Dr. Malefi was pointing when he was talking about the Hermetic text, the light for the second rise of Europe did not come out of their genius, just as the first rise did not come out of the Greek genius. It came out of the flow of culture and scientific data and scholarly materials that comes from African Arab Moorish civilization that was institutionalized around Islam from 700 AD to 1500 AD. And there's no second rise of Europe without you seeing that. And what the Europeans were able to do is to take that strength coming out of Africa and institutionalize it into a system of domination, destruction, and death. And so the Columbus period is when that system becomes institutionalized, and it explains things for us. Because people say, Dr. J, if Africans were at this great period of their development, if Native Americans were building stone cities in the sky and temples and cities in Central America, what happened? If Asians were doing what they were doing, Angkor Temple complex, and in China and India, what happened? What happened was this European value system of domination, destruction of death, came together around accidents of history. And you've got to take this down and let me quickly run it through you. I call it the 50-year turning point of history. The second rise of Europe during the Columbus period. That's why we have to understand why the Columbus period is significant for us to study. Not just to document our destruction and the destruction of Native Americans so we can ask for reparations, but to document how accidents of history allowed the European to rise on center stage, push everybody else off. When he brought forth this cave value system of domination, destruction, and death, and institutionalized it around Christianity to give it a God mission. 1482, Columbus and other Portuguese sailed down the coast of Africa, trying to touch base with Africans in order to get around Islamic civilization. They did not consider Africans inferior. They considered them people who they could ally with. They were looking for the Christian king Prester John in Ethiopia. And when they met the Africans along the coast of Africa, the Africans came down and greeted them with the hand of African Christian fellowship with their gold and their beautiful cloth, etc. And the Europeans were mesmerized because Europe, in the period before 1400s, was land poor, resource poor, and people poor. Land poor because European lands was controlled by this stagnating feudal system, dominated by the church. People poor because half the European population in many areas was wiped out by the bubonic plague. Resource poor because Europe, even today, is not a place where rich mineral resources can be found, except under the ice of suburbia, and that's in Asia. So land poor, resource poor, people poor was the condition of the Europeans. They were involved in an insanity of conflict and war, just like the early Greeks. When you study Greece, you got to study the conflict between Athens and Sparta, the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians. The whole history is a history of war and destruction. And that's why we have to see how this value system, institutionalized in the Greeks and passed on to the Romans, this value system of the warrior, this value system of the monosexual relationship of males to males, produced this domination of destruction and death, institutionalized in Greece, symbolized by Sparta, which was the prototype of the Nazi fascism that came out of ancient European culture and history, genetically pruning their own people to keep them at 10,000 warriors, that's Sparta, and dominating other Greeks, the Helots, and keeping them at 40,000, genetically pruning their people. By genetic pruning, we're talking about fratricide, we're talking about infanticide, killing off the children to keep them at a certain level, only producing certain male children as the epitome of what you need. This is the tradition of the Greeks. Athens was not a democracy. Diop and others outlined that Athens was a slave society. Only a few people with property and wealth, the 3 Ps, privileges, property, and power, were able to have a democratic relationship in Greece. Most of the Greeks were serfs and slaves. So this myth of Athenian democracy needs to be dealt with. That's why when they say America had a democracy in 1776, you need to understand what that means. They had an Athenian democracy. They had a democracy in which the people who had privilege, property, and power ruled and were dominating. And so we've got to understand what that is all about. Well, let me quickly run through this 50-year turning point of history because we have to see that we are now in an African 50-year turning point of history in the current era. The 50-year turning point of history, which was established 50 years ago, involved 1482 when they came to Elmina along the coast of Africa, looking for gold, not looking for Africans. Their minds were glittered with gold. 1492, they came back, and Columbus sailed the ocean blue and so-called discovered the New World. 1494, he came a second time, or third time, with sugar cane. 1494, also, the Portuguese and Spanish were discovering all these so-called colonies, planting their flags and putting their Bible down and taking their sword and chopping off the hands and the necks of the Africans. And so the Pope got into the deal. And the Treaty of Testadelas, coming out of the Papal Bull of 1493-94, divided up the world, gave half of it to Portugal and half of it to Spain. We're still living down that insanity of the Pope blessing the so-called imperialistic, greedy needs of these minuscule European nations. So these isms that we know about are being born. Mercantilism, colonialism, institutionalized around imperialism, become the rudiments of capitalism, racism, slavism, plantationism. 1496, Columbus first came with syphilis and other diseases. Now he comes with sugarcane. They try to institutionalize the work around sugarcane first within their own people because those were the people tried and true, semi-slaves and slaves on European feudal estates. Then they bring forth in 1496, sugarcane. After using European labor, it didn't work, then they tried Native American labor. When the Native Americans, as Professor Scobie was outlining, were dying off, then they brought forth African labor. It was the Catholic Church with Bartholomew de las Casas saying that we need to institutionalize African enslavement in order to save Native American souls. That's 1516, the Asiento, the contract to take Africans to the world. 1517, Luther, attacking the corruption of the Catholic Church, begins a process which becomes very important because the mindset of domination and the chosenness and the elect of God and the predestination of God has to be understood. Because Luther's Protestant Reformation brings that forth. And in 1532, Calvin takes it to a higher level. 1519, Cortez meets the Aztecs and takes their wealth. 1531-32, Pizarro meets the Incas and takes their wealth. And 1536, that concept of Calvin, of the theocratic state, linking together theology, politics, and economics, producing the modern European state. That foundation is now transferred from this minuscule nation of Geneva, Calvin's Geneva, to an insular, large landmass called England. In 1536, Henry VIII institutionalizes Anglicanism, a new brand of Protestantism for the English people. And it didn't come out of any religious conversion. It came out of his itchy penis. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, get rid of his wife, and the Pope said, if you do, I'll excommunicate you. And somehow or other, his wife died. He married Anne Boleyn. The Pope excommunicated him. And then the High Church of England, Anglicanism, was born. And it didn't come out of any religious conversion. It comes out of the itchy penis of Henry VIII. That's Episcopalianism, High Church Episcopalianism in America today. We need to understand the brand of Christianity that we have. You have to see this 50-year turning point of history as allowing the European to pull together land, labor, and resources in abundance, and then you have the upside-down pyramid of European devastation. Land, labor, and resources hooked up in a system of domination, destruction, and death, centered around the value system that came out of the Protestant Reformation of the elect of God. Certain people destined to rule over others. That's the raison d'etre of capitalism. That's the value system that was institutionalized by the European that allowed him to meet the Native Americans and wipe them out, and talk about manifest destiny. To go to Australia and wipe the people out, to go to South Africa and wipe them out and call themselves chosen by God in a covenant at Blood River. That's the Dutch Protestants that went down there. But they didn't go by themselves. They went with French Huguenots. They went with German Protestants. And those people institutionalized the system of death that we have in South Africa now. So we have to see their systems coming together with a capability of dominating land, labor, and resources, and the mental mind of the cave value system of domination, destruction, and death. And that's what we're up against. But fortunately, we're on a victorious path.
There you go.
And that's what I want to end on.
Speak the truth.
Thanks to a little people called the Japanese, who came to America quietly and mastered technology and went back quietly and pulled together the foundations of technology but kept Japanese culture intact. so that they could see themselves as sun people, the land of the rising sun, to take their place on the world. But unfortunately, it was built around that male principle of domination, and it became a perversion. But these Japanese were able to drop bombs on Pearl Harbor, and the pretense of European superiority was gone. The Japanese, in dropping bombs on Pearl Harbor, opened up the way for the struggles that took place around the world, some of them predating the Japanese. The Indochina struggle predates the Japanese, but it continued. The French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. The Chinese Revolution reached its fulfillment in 1949 with the People's Republic becoming free. The movement around Gandhi in 46, 47 brought forth Indian independence. In Africa, the Mau Mau movement of taking back the land was started. And Nkrumah went back to Ghana and began to lead the march that in the 50s led to Ghanaian independence. Nasser and Naguib become Africans coming up out of the Nile Valley, the first Africans, true Africans, to rule in Egypt in 2,000 years. And in 1952, they overthrow the Farouk and establish a new African dimension for Egypt. In Iran, Mossadegh seizes the oil, nationalizes the oil, and starts the Iranian Revolution that is continuing now. You have to see that the African peoples and Native American peoples and Sun peoples in Cuba and in the Caribbean and wherever we are have been on a victorious path. We are now in the 50-year turning point of African history, where African peoples went into this period with their lands dominated by Europeans, and now we have independence, albeit neo-independence. But the possibility of a free Africa is there for the 21st century. We have come into this position where our elites have been sucked off into the European and our mindsets have been captured by the European. But now we have the documentation, the information, the process to free ourselves of European colonization. And so we now can march and prepare for the 21st century with the image of an Africa intact, with value systems that transform the world, with knowledge that no one can go into the 21st century without Africa at the core. Do you think the Bushman and his folly could be produced over and over again if he does not have Africa, the uranium, the titanium, the vanadium, the manganese, the cobalt, all those minerals necessary for high tech are found on the African continent. So now we're in an African resurrection. All we need is an African mindset and the courage to make it real, and that's what the challenge is for your generation. I'm sure Dr. Ben is going to outline that at the banquet. What is the real challenge for your generation? You have the ability to tap into African knowledge and African understanding, African spirituality, to transform the world. Clark, Atlanta, Morehouse, Columbia University, Stanford, University of the West Indies, University of Ghana can't give you this understanding. You have to go out of these institutions and search it out. If you want these institutions to be meaningful, you may have to bring it back to these institutions. But you have to be on a serious search for this knowledge so it can transform you. You have to be bonding yourselves into fraternities and sororities that are African so it can have the units of struggle. And as we move forth together, we will be victorious. And as Marcus Garvey says, up you mighty people. Together we can do anything. Thank you very much.
We want to say thank you again to Dr. Jeffries for truly being a warrior and really representing and reflecting us. I wanted to say on behalf of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, Lynn is correct in bringing Dr. Diop's book in, and I don't have a copy of it now, but one of the things that we started out this morning with, this is it. We started out this morning when Dr. Noble said that he had only come to plant the seed. Because of the time element, we don't even have time to even start digging up the ground. So it's hoped that what was going on today is at least started planting the seed, and that if you go somewhere and nourish it, get the knowledge, get the understanding, that you can in fact come back and multiply and build the world in our own image and interest. And it's said in this book, Civilization and Barbarism, and I think ASCAC certainly wants to reflect that only the implanting of a scientific discipline in Black America would one day lead to the grasping of the richness and the novelty of the cultural conscience that we want to awaken, its quality, its depth, its creative power. The African who has understood us is the one who, after reading our works, would have felt a birth in self of another person, impelled by an historical conscience, a true creator, an Imhotep carrier of a new civilization, and perfectly aware of what the whole earth owes to his ancestral genius in all the domains of science, culture, and religion. I want to say to you that the doors of ASCAC are open to you, and we believe that it's not enough just to educate and develop yourself, but it is also the responsibility for you to educate and develop those whom you lead, touch, and influence. So I want to say thank you for coming this afternoon. There are a few more people that I would like to stand, and this is what take 1 second. And because they've been so instrumental in getting the information out, as Lynn has said, our scholars have done the work, but it takes a cadre of people to start managing that data, to get the information out, to disseminate the information. And in that, we have a local study group here in the Atlanta area. We also have Sister Peggy Brown, if you would please stand up, and also the ASCAC members in the audience, if you would please stand up. We have Tony from South Carolina. We have Askia from Atlanta. We have Larry Williams, who's our national board member. So as you can see, the information is getting out. And one thing that Lynn insisted on, I wanted him to say it, but I'll say it just from his fervor, is that in this war to win the hearts and the minds of the people, we are not taking any prisoners. So the war is on, brothers and sisters. Join up. We need your support. Thank you.
You know, I said this before, and I want to keep repeating to this. Her group, their group, I belong to, ASCAP.
And also a member,
and she
paid
belongs
in
to
full.
AHSA. We support each other.
Right.
We are a family. We have different responsibilities.
Right.
They do study groups. We do what we're doing now, theoretical. You understand what I'm saying? And we work together. We work in a complementary pattern.
Teach.
And so now I want to get some volunteers, because these wonderful brothers, I'm sure you have noticed that they have not rested.
Wow.
They were not supposed to videotape the 5 concurrent panels, but they videotaped certain ones. They have not rested, and they need to get this equipment over to Thayer Hall. So I need some volunteers, brothers and strong sisters, or weak brothers and weak sisters. I need some volunteers for these brothers. All this equipment has to be moved over to the banquet hall.
Okay,
So
we have
those-
all the brothers right here. Just
Well, it's
volunteer.
okay. Just go over there
Okay.
and make yourself known. And we have to get the band over there. Remember that the banquet has been changed to right behind this building. And in fact, they wanted us over there by 7:30. This is going to be a miracle. We'll call on Len Jeffries, our African Holy Spirit, to get us down the hotel, change.
Have a